Hello everyone, my name is Rukuto Kamo from XII Kohima. We are so grateful to the Department of School Education, Government of Nagaland for giving us a slot to introduce XII to you through this medium. What or who is XII? XII 1098 is a national toll-free helpline number for children in distress and in need of care and protection, which operates 24/7. It is a project under the Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India. XII is currently operating in 570 cities all across India and presently operating in 5 districts in Nagaland, that is Kohima, Dimapur, Mokokchung, Peren and Kiferi. Who can call 1098? A child or any concerned adult can call 1098 anytime for children in distress and in need of care and protection. XII do not reveal the identity of the person calling 1098. It is always kept confidential. What are the categories of cases supported by XII? There are the missing children, the runaway children, abused children, children seeking medical assistance, child labor, street children, and all kinds of children in need of care and protection. What are some of the services extended to children by XII? We respond to phone call 24/7, rescue of a child if need arise, nutrition and emotional support and guidance through counseling, referral services such as medical assistance, temporary shelter, education sponsorship, restoration and repatriation of a child to their families in the best interest of the child. How do we create awareness? We conduct awareness programs in college, schools, churches, colonies, outreach programs through one-to-one interaction, small group meetings, and distribution of our XII IEC materials. We also create awareness on the existence of XII and its services and the different laws of our country protecting our children. We also create awareness on the cases prevalent in our city. XII does not work alone or in isolation. We work along with various line government departments and agencies like the district administration, the police department, the legal department, education department, medical department, labor department, the social welfare department, state child protection society, district child protection unit, the child welfare committee, our XII partners in different parts of the country, and all the NGOs working for children. In conclusion, we want to send a message across to everyone that even as the entire world and our nation is battling against COVID-19 pandemic, XII is still there to reach out to any child in distress and in need of care and protection. We also take this opportunity to make an appeal to each and everyone to please call 1098 whenever you see any child in distress and in need of care and protection. Let us all join hands to make our city a safe place for our children to live in. Thank you, God bless, and stay safe.
Hello everyone, welcome back to economics class. I hope everyone is keeping yourself fine at home. Now in this session, as it is written on the board, I want to discuss fiscal policy with you. If you refer your textbook, this will be on chapter 9, unit 5. So it starts from page number 156. You might want to refer your textbook. And since we have lesser minutes than the previous one, we will try to focus on the most important ones. So you please try to be attentive. Now, what is fiscal policy? It's actually the policy of taxation and government spending to achieve certain specified economic targets or objectives. I'm repeating, it refers to the use of taxation and government spending to achieve certain specified targets or objectives by the government. So why fiscal policy? Why does the government need fiscal policy? The government needs this in order to influence the level of aggregate demand, to control and curb the situations of excess demand and excess supply. Because in both the situations of excess demand and excess supply, it disturbs the smooth and normal functioning of the economy. That's why the government needs fiscal policy to influence this aggregate demand and control or curb the abnormalities of excess demand and excess supply. Excess demand, it normally happens during the time of inflation when aggregate demand becomes very large. Likewise, excess supply happens during the time of depression where aggregate demand becomes very less, and therefore it can also be said termed as excess supply. The reason I'm just running off is because we have explained all this in the previous sessions. Now we want to discuss on the types of fiscal policy. There are two types of fiscal policy. Number one, contractionary fiscal policy, and number two, expansionary fiscal policy. From the term itself, it clearly tells us that contraction meaning becoming smaller or tight. Expansion meaning it's increasing. That's why expansionary is also called easy fiscal policy. Now, why should the government follow or adopt contractionary fiscal policy? You please look at the board. Contractionary fiscal policy is adopted in order to reduce or decrease the aggregate demand by raising the taxation and also reducing government expenditure, or which is technically termed as public expenditure. Now, this contractionary fiscal policy is adopted in times of inflation. Inflation is one of the phases in trade cycle where the aggregate demand becomes very large. There is excess demand, and therefore, in order to control this, the government will resort to contractionary fiscal policy where they will start raising all forms of taxation, direct and indirect tax, and then the government will also try to reduce its routine expenditure. And when this is done, the economy will come back to normalcy, or to some extent, aggregate demand will be controlled. Just opposite to this, another type of fiscal policy, we have expansionary or easy fiscal policy. So the government adopts contractionary fiscal policy in order to increase the aggregate demand, because the aggregate demand is very low, or there is excess demand, excess supply. This happens in time of depression. Depression is a stage where aggregate demand becomes very less. When aggregate demand becomes very less, the profits or the income of the businessman is affected. And when it happens, it will have a far-reaching negative impact. The government, in order to correct this problem, will resort to expansionary fiscal policy where they will start reducing all forms of taxation. At the same time, they will also start to increase its expenditure, all forms of government expenditure. And when this happens, it will lead to increase in aggregate demand, thereby bringing back the economy to normalcy. So these are the two types of fiscal policy we have discussed. I want you to focus on the measures part. This is the most important part in this topic. There are 4 measures of fiscal policy. So the first one is expansionary policy. The first one is expenditure policy. Number 2, revenue or taxation policy. Number 3, public borrowing. And number 4, deficit financing. So in both contractionary and expansionary fiscal policy, the government will adopt all the 4 measures at a time to bring back the economy to normalcy. Now, suppose if the government adopts contractionary fiscal policy, they will use all the 4 measures. If the government adopts expansionary fiscal policy, they will adopt all the 4 measures. So we want to discuss this one by one. Contractionary fiscal policy. Number 1, expenditure policy. So the government have now realized that there is inflation. There is large or there is excess demand in the economy. When there is excess demand, from business point of view, it's always a profit. But common people like you and I, we are badly affected. And therefore, in order to control this, the government will adopt expenditure policy under contractionary fiscal policy. So the government will now try to reduce all forms of its public works, like construction of roads, construction of railways, construction of buildings, and all forms of expenditure which is undertaken by the government will be slowly and gradually controlled. And when this is controlled, directly it will lead to a decline in the income of the people, and therefore when the income of the people are affected, their demand will also slowly and gradually fall. Are you getting the point or not? There is a linkage over here. When the government reduces their routine public expenditure, like construction of roads, highways, buildings, electrification of rural villages, sanitation, health, so on and so forth. When all these are controlled, slowly and gradually, the income of the people will be affected. And when income of the people is reduced, their demand for goods and services will also be affected, thereby bringing back the economy to normalcy, thereby controlling excess demand. Are you all getting the point or not? Number 2, we have revenue or taxation policy. Why revenue or taxation? It's simply because government earns by taxing the people. And therefore, we have already used both revenue and taxation at the time. It's same. Revenue, it's for the government. They generate this revenue by taxing the people. That's why it is called revenue or taxation policy. Now, under contractionary fiscal policy, what does the government do? The government will now raise all forms of taxation. And according to your textbook, if possible, the government should raise taxation on the rich people. When taxation is raised, the purchasing power of the people is reduced. Suppose you have 10 rupees. Initially, you are paying 1 rupee to the government as tax. You can spend 9 rupees. Your demand for goods and services is large because you still have 9 rupees. Now, it has led to inflation. The government wants to control that. Now, the government will raise the taxation to 3 rupees or 4 rupees. If the taxation is raised to, let's say, 4 rupees, how much money is left with you? You have only 6 rupees with you, and therefore your demand will also be controlled. Are you getting the point or not? So, during contractionary fiscal policy, the government will try to increase or raise all forms of taxation. But one very important thing that you should remember is, you might want to refer your textbook. While the government tries to raise revenue by taxing the people, enough care should be made in order to make sure that no harm is done on the production, and no harm should also be done on the savings part. Are you getting the point or not? In this contractionary fiscal policy, what is the government doing? The government is trying to reduce the excess demand, and therefore they have now raised the taxation. While doing so, the government should ensure that no harm should be done on the production and on the savings as well. So that's the most important part in this point. And then we have public borrowing. Public borrowing simply means a situation when the government resorts to borrowing money from the public. So in contractionary fiscal policy, the government will resort to borrowing excess supply of money from the people. People, they have a lot of money with them, and therefore their demand for goods and services is very large, thereby leading to inflation. Now the government is trying to borrow money from all these people. So when all this excess supply of money is moved up by the government, the demand for goods and services by the people will also be affected or not. So that's it. And then deficit financing. Before we explain this part, we want to explain the meaning. What is deficit financing? A situation where there is excess of expenditure over revenue by the government. Now, in order to make up this excess expenditure, the government resorts to minting or printing new currency notes. So when new currency notes are minted and printed, that is simply called deficit financing. Getting the point or not? In times of contractionary fiscal policy, what does the government do? The government should try to control deficit financing as much as possible. Because when the government continues to print out new currency and pump it in the economy, it will lead to inflation. So the government should reduce deficit financing, should keep deficit financing at a safe zone so that inflation is controlled. But how does the government keep deficit financing in a safe zone? The government does it by organizing, you have to refer your textbook, by organizing small savings like PPF. I'm sure you must have heard, Public Provident Fund or not. Then we have national saving certificates, etc. All these are a form of saving from the government employees. When all these are introduced with incentives, with large interest rate, the people will come forward to save their money. So instead of printing out new currency, the government can make use of all these. All right, so in order to keep deficit financing in a safe zone, they can resort to all these so that inflation to some extent is controlled. So when the government follows contractionary fiscal policy, all these four measures are adopted. Likewise, when the government follows expansionary fiscal policy, the same four will be adopted, but opposite of what we have explained. So like in expenditure policy, what should the government do under expansionary fiscal policy? The government will try to increase their routine public works like construction of roads, like same example, okay, construction of roads, highways, canals, irrigation, and also, try to give free services like schooling, like education, health, so on and so forth. When all these are implemented, it will lead to increase in income of the people. When income of the people are increased, it will lead to increase in the demand for goods and services, and therefore, slowly and gradually, depression will go away. Are you all listening or not? Now, in this part, under expansionary fiscal policy, what you should remember is, yes, when the expenditure of the government is raised, when the expenditure of the government is increased, it will automatically lead to deficit budget. In Nagaland, deficit budget is nothing new because it usually happens every year. But we should not worry. As an underdeveloped country, deficit budget is always a welcome step. It has been supported by a very renowned economist by the name James Keynes. He also advocated deficit budget in order to increase aggregate demand. So you will come across all these in detail in higher classes. That's point number one. Number two, revenue or taxation. Over here also, what does the government do when they follow expansionary fiscal policy? The government will try to reduce all forms of taxation. If possible, reduce the taxation or abolish taxation from the middle income earning people. When taxations are abolished, obviously the purchasing power of the people will increase. When the purchasing power of the people increases, their demand for goods and services will increase. Slowly and gradually, depression will go away. And then under this point, not only reduction of taxation, but when the government follows expansionary fiscal policy, the government should also increase their subsidies. Subsidies are financial assistance given to the sick industries or maybe to the needy industries. Then not only that, unemployment allowances, have you heard, can also be increased. Scholarship, all forms of free money that is given by the government to the public should be increased. When this is done, income of the people will increase, thereby leading to increase in the demand for goods and services. When demand for goods and services increases, depression will slowly and gradually go away. Likewise, public borrowing. In times of expansionary fiscal policy, the government should reduce or stop borrowing money from the public. Because if the government continues to borrow money from the public, the supply of money with the people will be less. Their demand is affected. And therefore, the government should reduce public borrowing in times of expansionary fiscal policy. Then lastly, we have, where is it? We have deficit financing. I have already explained what does this mean. Excess of expenditure over revenue. The government has overspent than what they have expected to earn from revenue. And therefore, in order to bridge the gap, they bring out new currency and then they try to, pump in the economy. Now, when the government follows expansionary fiscal policy, what does the government do? The government should encourage. The government should encourage deficit financing. So when the government prints out new currency and pump it in the economy, automatically, slowly and gradually, it will lead to increase in income of the people. When income of the people increases, their demand for goods and services will also increase. And when demand for goods and services increase, slowly and gradually, depression will go away. Slowly and gradually, the level of aggregate demand will raise. And when this happens, the primary objective of the government is achieved. And therefore, to conclude our session today, fiscal policy, the meaning, then the types of fiscal policy, and the four measures. So while explaining the four measures, under expenditure policy and taxation, some important lines that I have already mentioned earlier, you have to include all those when you write for your exams. Getting the point or not? So for now, this will be the end of the session. In the next session, we will discuss monetary policy. It will be in the same chapter, but next page. Understood? So that concludes the session for today. Thank you so much.